There is something deeply human about throwing a round object toward a target. Before there were courts, before there were uniforms, before there were rules or referees or roaring crowds, there was the simple and satisfying act of launching something through the air and watching it pass through a goal. That impulse to aim, to arc, to score runs through thousands of years of human history, and it eventually became the sport of basketball. This is the story of how that happened. Part 1. The Ancient Roots. The earliest ball games we know of appear not in one place, but in many. Across Egypt, across Greece, across China and Japan and the Americas, human beings independently arrived at the same basic idea. Take a round object, put it in play between two groups of people, and decide a winner. In ancient Egypt, as far back as 2000 BC, images carved into temples show figures handling balls in what appear to be ceremonial contexts. In ancient Greece, a game called episkiros was played between two teams who drove a ball across territorial lines by throwing and passing with their hands. The Romans had their version too, harpastum, a rough and physical handball game that soldiers played to stay sharp. But they all shared something essential with it: a ball, two teams, and the hands as the primary instruments. But the game that most clearly anticipates basketball, the one that introduced the concept of a hoop, came not from Europe, but from Mesoamerica. The Olmec people, living along the Gulf Coast of what is now Mexico, were playing a formal ball game as early as 1600 BC. They used a rubber ball, something no civilization in the Old World had yet imagined. And they played on long and narrow stone courts. Over time, as the game spread to the Maya, the Aztec, and dozens of other civilizations across Central America, it acquired a feature that would echo forward through 3,000 years of history. A stone ring mounted vertically on the wall of the court. The goal was to pass the rubber ball through that ring, not by kicking it, not by throwing it with an overhand sling, but by striking it with the hip, the knee, or the forearm. The rules varied across cultures and centuries. The significance of the hoop varied too, but the basic concept, a round ball, a circular elevated target, and the challenge of guiding one through the other, was there. It was there in stone and rubber, in the courts of Chichen Itza and Monte Alban, long before anyone in Massachusetts had ever thought about a peach basket. The game carried enormous ritual weight. It was tied to the movement of the sun and moon, to the underworld, to sacrifice and renewal. Winning or losing could determine the fates of entire communities. The court itself was sacred ground. That game spread throughout Mesoamerica for over 2,000 years, played by dozens of civilizations in dozens of forms. And then European colonization arrived, and it was largely buried. But the idea, the hoop, survived in the cultural memory of the continent. Across the Atlantic, European handball traditions were developing along their own track. In France, beginning around the 12th century, people played a game called Jeu du Paume, the game of the palm. You struck a ball with your bare hand, then eventually a gloved one, across a court or against a wall. It was the direct ancestor of tennis, but in its earliest form it was purely a hand game played in enclosed courtyards by French nobility. The enclosed court, bounded, specific, designed for play, was an important conceptual step. Sport was moving indoors. By the medieval period, folk ball games were being played across England and France during festivals and holidays. Mob football, Shrove Tuesday games, chaotic community contests with few rules and many bruises. Players ran and threw and grappled. The ball went where bodies forced it. These games had almost nothing in common with basketball on the surface, but they represent the deep European instinct for communal ball play, the social ritual that organized sport would eventually formalize. Then came the 19th century, and everything changed. Part 2. The 19th century and the conditions for invention. In the mid-1800s, something happened in American and British culture that created the perfect conditions for organized sport to flourish. It was called the muscular Christianity movement. The idea was straightforward. The health of the body and the health of the soul were connected. Physical education was moral education. A strong young man who played organized games was a virtuous young man. This philosophy swept through schools, universities, and the YMCA, which had been founded in London in 1844 and spread rapidly to North America. The YMCA in particular became an engine for inventing and disseminating new athletic activities. Its mission was to provide wholesome recreation for young men in cities, to give them something productive to do with their bodies and their evenings. And that mission would eventually, and quite directly, give the world basketball. By the 1880s, American college gymnasiums were filling up with young men who wanted to play team sports, but couldn't go outside for 5 months out of the year. Football and baseball were outdoor games. The gym offered parallel bars and dumbbells and rope climbing, but nothing that felt like sport in the full, competitive, social sense of the word. The athletic directors knew they had a problem. A satisfying indoor team game simply did not exist. Into this gap stepped a Canadian physical education instructor named James Naismith. Naismith was studying at the International YMCA Training School in Springfield, Massachusetts, what is now Springfield College, in the fall of 1891. His supervisor, Dr. Luther Gulick, gave him an assignment that sounds almost impossibly simple in retrospect. Invent a new indoor sport, something that could be played in a gym, that was energetic and competitive, that required skill rather than brute force, and that could keep a class of restless young men engaged through a New England winter. Naismith had just 2 weeks. He spent much of that time thinking about childhood games he'd played growing up in Ontario, particularly a game called Duck on a Rock, in which players tried to knock a stone off a boulder by lobbing other stones at it in a soft arc. The arc was the key insight. You couldn't muscle a rock off another rock with a straight, flat throw. The physics didn't work. You had to loft it. You had to think about angle and trajectory. The game rewarded touch over power. That insight became the conceptual heart of basketball. On a December morning in 1891, Naismith nailed 2 peach baskets to the elevated running track in the Springfield gym, one at each end about 10 feet off the ground. He grabbed a soccer ball. He wrote out 13 rules in roughly an hour, rules that emphasized passing, positioning, and shooting over physical contact, and he introduced the game to his class. The response was immediate. Within weeks, people were playing it across the YMCA network. Within months, it had spread to Canada. Within years, it had reached England, France, India, China, and Australia. It was one of the fastest spreading sports inventions in history, and it spread almost entirely by word of mouth through the YMCA's global network of young men who had played it once and couldn't stop thinking about it. After 3,000 years of human ball play, Mesoamerican hoops, and Greek hand games, and French palm courts, Naismith had synthesized it, almost certainly without knowing it. Part 3. Basketball spreads across America. The first decade of basketball's existence was chaotic and joyful in equal measure. It spread through YMCAs, then to colleges, then to high schools, then to industrial leagues and neighborhood clubs. By the mid-1890s, it was being played in nearly every state in the country. Women's basketball appeared almost immediately. Senda Berenson adapted the rules for women at Smith College in 1892, just 1 year after the game's invention, and women's collegiate basketball would thrive throughout the early 20th century. The first professional basketball game is generally dated to 1896 in Trenton, New Jersey, where players charged admission to a game and split the proceeds among themselves. One player, Fred Cooper, reportedly received $1 more than his teammates, making him arguably the highest paid professional basketball player in history at that moment. From those humble origins, professional basketball slowly organized itself into barnstorming teams and regional circuits. Traveling squads would move from town to town, playing local teams in any available hall or gym. The game was rough, the pay was irregular, and the conditions were often chaotic, but the audiences kept coming. At the same time, college basketball was growing faster than the professional game. Regional rivalries, conference tournaments, and eventually national tournaments gave college basketball the kind of organized structure that pro basketball would spend decades trying to replicate. For much of the early 20th century, the college game was simply more prestigious, more organized, and more watched than the pro one. Part 4. The pre-NBA pro game and the segregated leagues. By the 1920s, there were enough professional teams in the northeastern U.S. to constitute something like a league. The American Basketball League, founded in 1825, was the first serious attempt to organize pro basketball on a national scale. It had salary caps, standardized rules, and a regular schedule. It was in many ways ahead of its time, and it collapsed during the Great Depression, a casualty of the broader economic catastrophe. But while the white professional leagues were struggling and reorganizing, something remarkable was happening in Black America. In 1923, a man named Robert Douglas founded the New York Renaissance, a black professional basketball team based in Harlem. The Wrens, as they were known, were extraordinary. They traveled the country, often under hostile and dangerous conditions, denied hotels and restaurants because of segregation, and they won at an astonishing rate. During the 1932-33 season, they went 88-2. They were, by any objective measure, one of the best pro teams in the country, and they were almost entirely invisible to the mainstream press. 3 years later, in 1926, Abe Saperstein founded the Harlem Globetrotters. The Globetrotters began as a serious competitive team. They were not initially the comedy exhibition act they later became, and they too were among the elite professional teams of their era. They beat the Minneapolis Lakers, the best white pro team in the country, in front of 18,000 people in 1948. The segregation of American pro basketball was not a product of talent. It was a product of bigotry, and it would not be formally dismantled until 1950. Before that reckoning, basketball made one more significant appearance on the world stage. In 1936, at the Berlin Olympics, basketball was introduced as an official Olympic sport. The games were played outdoors, on dirt and sand courts, in the rain, with a soggy ball that barely bounced. The U.S. won gold. James Naismith himself was in attendance, and he presented the medals. America took its first step toward believing that basketball was its game to win. That belief would hold, mostly, for more than 50 years. Part 5. Birth of the NBA. In 1946, a group of businessmen who owned large indoor sports arenas had a problem. Their arenas, buildings like Madison Square Garden, the Boston Garden, the Chicago Stadium, were built for hockey, but hockey only filled them for half the winter. The other nights, those massive, expensive buildings sat empty. The owners needed a product to fill the seats. Their solution was basketball. The Basketball Association of America was founded in the summer of 1946. It had 11 teams, all based in large cities with large arenas. Its ambition was to be a major professional league, on the level of baseball and football, not a regional curiosity, not a barnstorming circuit, but a legitimate national sport. At the same time, a rival league, the National Basketball League, which had been operating in the Midwest since the late 1930s, was still in existence, still playing in smaller markets with smaller venues. The two leagues competed for players, and for a few years the talent was genuinely split between them. The tension couldn't last. In 1949, the two leagues merged. The resulting organization took a new name, the National Basketball Association. The early NBA was fragile. Teams folded, franchises relocated, rosters turned over constantly. There were 17 teams in the first NBA season, and only 8 by 1954. The league was trying to find its footing, trying to establish which cities could support a pro basketball franchise, trying to figure out what kind of game it wanted to present to the public. And it had one enormous piece of good luck, a player named George Mikan. Part 6. The Mikan Era, the Shot Clock, and Integration. George Mikan was 6'10", in an era when most pro players were under 6'4". He was not particularly fast or graceful. He didn't need to be. He simply stood near the basket and was almost impossible to stop. He led the Minneapolis Lakers to 5 championships between 1949 and 1954. He was the first true superstar of pro basketball, the first player whose name alone could sell tickets, the first player the league could build a marketing identity around. He was also a problem. Mikan was so dominant, that opposing teams developed a strategy of simply holding the ball, standing still, passing among themselves, running down the clock to avoid giving him the ball in a dangerous position. Games became unwatchably slow. One game between the Fort Wayne Pistons and the Lakers in 1950 ended 19-18. Something had to change. In 1954, the NBA introduced the 24-second shot clock. Once a team gained possession of the ball, they had 24 seconds to attempt a shot. If they didn't, the other team got the ball. It sounds like a simple administrative rule. It was, in fact, one of the most important innovations in the history of sports. Overnight, the game transformed. Teams had to shoot. They had to move. They had to play offense with urgency. Scoring averages jumped dramatically. The game became faster, more dynamic, and dramatically more entertaining. Attendance rose. The 24-second shot clock did not save the NBA. The league still had years of struggle ahead of it, but it gave the league a game worth saving. That same year, the league was wrestling with another kind of transformation. In 1950, the NBA quietly became integrated. 3 black players entered the league that season. Chuck Cooper, drafted by the Boston Celtics, Nat Sweetwater Clifton, purchased from the Harlem Globetrotters by the New York Knicks, and Earl Lloyd, who took the court for the Washington Capitals and became, by one game's timing, the first black player to appear in an NBA game. There was no announcement. There was no ceremony. The integration happened with a kind of institutional understatement that almost obscured its historic weight. But its effect on the game was profound and cumulative. Over the following decade, as black players entered the league in greater numbers, the athletic level, the style of play, and the cultural identity of professional basketball all shifted in ways that would define everything that came after. Part 7. The Russell Celtics Dynasty. In the mid-1950s, the Boston Celtics acquired 2 men who would change pro basketball permanently. The first was Red Auerbach. The head coach, a stubby, combative, brilliant man from Brooklyn, was already establishing himself as the shrewdest evaluator of talent in the league. The second was Bill Russell. Russell had won 2 NCAA championships at the University of San Francisco and a gold medal at the 1956 Melbourne Olympics before he ever played a pro game. He arrived in Boston in '56 and immediately did something no basketball player had ever done quite so completely before. He made defense the most important thing. Russell was not the greatest scorer. He was not the most graceful player. What he was the greatest defensive player who had ever lived. He read the geometry of the game with an almost eerie clarity. He knew where the ball was going before the offensive player did. He blocked shots not to show off, but to redirect them to his own teammates, turning defense into offense in a single motion. He made the fast break a weapon and the block shot an art form. The Celtics won 11 NBA titles in 13 seasons between 1957 and 1969. No team in any North American pro sport has come close to that level of sustained dominance before or since. The dynasty was built on defense, on ball movement, on Auerbach's extraordinary talent evaluation, and on Russell's singular brilliance at the center of it all. Across the league, a very different kind of brilliance was emerging. Wilt Chamberlain was everything Russell was not, at least on the surface. Where Russell was a team player by disposition and philosophy, Chamberlain was an individual force of nature, 7 feet tall, perhaps the most physically gifted basketball player who's ever lived. In the 1961-62 season, he averaged 50.4 points per game. On March 2nd, 1962, he scored 100 points in a single game against the New York Knicks in Hershey, Pennsylvania, in a building with maybe 4,000 people in the seats. The Russell versus Chamberlain rivalry became the defining narrative of the era, not just as competition, but as philosophy, defense versus offense, team versus individual. Each man made the other better, and the league was bigger because both of them existed within it. Around them, other stars burned brightly. Elgin Baylor brought a kind of airborne improvisation to the game that nobody had seen before, hanging in the air, changing direction mid-flight, inventing the aerial artistry that Julius Erving and Michael Jordan would later complete. Oscar Robertson played the entire 1961-62 season, averaging a triple-double. Jerry West was so complete a player that his silhouette became and remains the official logo of the NBA. The league was beginning to feel, for the first time, like it had stars worth watching. Part 8. The ABA, the three-point line, and the dark years. By the late 1960s, the NBA had established itself as a legitimate major pro sports league, but it was about to face its most serious competitive challenge. In 1967, a rival league launched, the American Basketball Association. The ABA was different from the NBA in almost every visible way. Its ball was red, white, and blue. Its arenas were smaller and louder. Its players were more flamboyant. And it had a rule that the NBA did not, the three-point line. A shot made from beyond a designated arc, roughly 23 feet from the basket, was worth 3 points instead of 2. It sounds obvious now. It sounds like it was always going to be part of basketball. But in 1967, the three-point line was a radical idea, a gimmick, the NBA establishment said. A cheap trick to inflate scoring and attract casual fans. What it actually was a revolution waiting to happen. The ABA's three-point line changed the spatial logic of the game. Suddenly, the entire court was dangerous. A shooter standing 25 feet from the basket wasn't wasting space. He was a threat that forced the defense to extend, to spread, to leave gaps. The floor opened up, the game opened up, and while the NBA looked down its nose at the idea, the ABA was developing something genuinely exciting. The greatest player in the ABA was Julius Erving, Dr. J, a forward from Roosevelt, New York, whose style of play was unlike anything pro basketball had seen. He took off from improbable distances, hung in the air longer than physics seemed to allow, and finished at the rim with a grace and creativity that made crowds gasp. Dr. J was the ABA's answer to the NBA's establishment heroes, and many people thought he was better than all of them. The two leagues competed fiercely for players and markets throughout the late 1960s and early 70s. In 1976, the financial strain became unsustainable for the ABA. The league dissolved, and 4 of its teams, the San Antonio Spurs, the New York Nets, the Indiana Pacers, and the Denver Nuggets, were absorbed into the NBA. But the ABA's most important legacy wasn't any of those franchises. It was the three-point line. The NBA adopted it in 1979. At first, players used it sparingly, as a desperation shot, a buzzer beater option, a weapon of last resort. Coaches didn't build offenses around it. The arc was there, but it was mostly decoration. That would eventually change in ways nobody in 1979 could have predicted. The three-point shot would, over the following decades, gradually reshape every single strategic principle in the game. Spacing, shot selection, player development, roster construction. By the time the modern NBA arrived, the three-point line hadn't just influenced the game, it had remade it from the floor up. But in the late 70s, the NBA had more immediate problems than offensive strategy. The league was struggling. Drug use, cocaine in particular, was rampant and badly managed. On-court violence was a genuine concern. The product on the floor was often ugly. Television ratings were collapsing. The NBA Finals were being broadcast on tape delay by CBS. Not live, but airing after the late local news, treated like a minor regional sporting event rather than a national championship. Attendance was down. Franchises were losing money. The league was, without exaggerating very much, in genuine danger. Part 9. Magic, Bird, and the NBA Renaissance. It was saved by two men from very different places, with very different styles, who created together something that neither could have created alone. On March 26, 1979, Michigan State University played Indiana State University for the NCAA National Championship. Michigan State had a sophomore named Irvin Johnson, already going by Magic, who was 6'9" and could play every position on the floor, who saw passing lanes before they existed, who played basketball with an expression of pure, infectious joy that TV cameras could not stop finding. Indiana State had a senior named Larry Bird, quiet, pale, from a tiny town in rural Indiana, who played without any visible athleticism, but with a precision and intelligence and competitive ferocity that seemed to operate on a different plane than ordinary human effort. More than 35 million people watched that game. It was the highest-rated basketball broadcast in history. Magic went first in the NBA draft that June. Bird went third. Both went to storied franchises that needed them desperately. Magic to the Los Angeles Lakers, Bird to the Boston Celtics, and over the following decade, they remade the NBA. The Lakers were already gifted. For one thing, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, the greatest center of his generation, was there. What Magic added was something less tangible and more total. An energy, a pace, a sense that something wonderful was about to happen on every possession. The Showtime Lakers ran and flew and dazzled. They filled the Forum in Inglewood with celebrities, with glamour, with the particular electricity of a team that seemed to be having more fun than any team in pro sports. In Boston, Bird rebuilt the Celtics as a different kind of machine, precise, intelligent, suffocatingly well executed. He was surrounded with Hall of Fame teammates, Kevin McHale, Robert Parrish, Dennis Johnson, and constructed an offense that punished every defensive mistake with perfect ruthlessness. The Lakers and Celtics met in the NBA Finals 3 times during the 80s. 1984, 85, and 87. Each series was a national event. TV ratings soared to levels the NBA had never seen. The sport was back. Into this renaissance, the NBA hired a new commissioner. David Stern took over in 1984. He was a lawyer and a visionary, and he understood something that his predecessors had not fully grasped. Basketball players were not just athletes. They were entertainers. They were personalities. They were brands. The NBA, under Stern, became one of the first sports leagues to aggressively market its players as individual stars, putting their faces on merchandise, building TV campaigns around their personalities, making the names Magic and Bird into cultural shorthand for something much larger than basketball. The league cleaned up its drug problem through a rigorous testing and treatment program. It signed better TV deals. It expanded internationally. By the late 80s, the NBA was not just solvent, it was a phenomenon. And then a young man from North Carolina arrived, and the phenomenon became something else entirely. Part 10. Michael Jordan and the Transition Era. Michael Jordan was drafted by the Chicago Bulls with the third pick in 1984, the same year David Stern became commissioner. He was, from his first season, visibly different from everyone around him. The speed, the elevation, the body control, it was all extraordinary. But what separated Jordan most was something harder to quantify. A competitive intensity so deep and constant that it seemed less like a personality trait and more like a physical law. He simply could not accept losing. Not in a game, not in a practice, not in a card game on a team bus. In 1985, Nike released the Air Jordan 1. It was a basketball shoe in red and black that technically violated the NBA's uniform color rules. The league fined Jordan $5,000 every time he wore them, and Nike cheerfully paid the fines as a marketing strategy. The shoe sold $162 million worth in its first year. The partnership between Jordan and Nike became one of the most successful athlete endorsements in commercial history. And more importantly, it established Jordan not just as a basketball player, but as a global cultural figure. On the floor, the Bulls' ascent was slower than Jordan's personal stardom. The obstacle was Detroit. The Bad Boy Pistons, coached by Chuck Daly, angered by Isaiah Thomas, and forced by Rick Mahorn and Bill Laimbeer, were one of the most physically intimidating teams in NBA history. They developed what they openly called the Jordan Rules, a specific set of defensive assignments designed to make Jordan's life as uncomfortable as possible. Hit him when he drives. Make him earn every single point with his body. Don't give him anything easy. It worked for a while. The Pistons eliminated the Bulls in the playoffs in 1988, 89, and 90. Then Phil Jackson arrived as Chicago's head coach. Jackson brought the triangle offense, a complex ball movement system that distributed the offensive burden across the entire team and made Jordan, paradoxically, more dangerous by making him less predictable. Jackson also brought Scottie Pippen into full partnership with Jordan. Pippen, one of the most complete two-way players in the history of the game, gave the Bulls a second star who could guard the opposing team's best player while facilitating everything Jordan needed on offense. In '91, the Bulls swept the Pistons in the Eastern Conference Finals. The Bad Boys walked off the floor without shaking hands. Chicago's obstacle was cleared. The Bulls beat Magic's Lakers in the '91 Finals in 5 games. Jordan won his first championship. Magic, gracious as ever, said afterward that Jordan was the best he'd ever seen. The torch had been passed. Part 11. International Basketball. While all of this was happening inside American arenas, something was shifting in other parts of the world. Since basketball's debut in the 1936 Olympics, the U.S. had approached Olympic basketball with a comfortable confidence. American college players, amateurs technically by Olympic rules, were good enough to beat the rest of the world. The game had spread globally, but the gap between American basketball and everyone else's basketball was simply too large to close. That was the assumption. In 1972, at the Munich Olympics, the Soviet Union appeared to beat the U.S. in the gold medal game on one of the most controversial final sequences in Olympic history. 3 seconds were put back on the clock, twice. The Soviets scored as time expired and were awarded the victory. The American players refused their silver medals. The incident burned into the American basketball consciousness. And then came 1988. At the Seoul Olympics, the U.S. men's team, a strong college squad with several future NBA players on the roster, lost to the Soviet Union in the semifinals. They went home with bronze. Bronze. The basketball world stopped and took notice, not because American basketball had declined, but because global basketball had risen. The European leagues, particularly in Yugoslavia, Spain, the Soviet Union, and Lithuania, were producing players of genuine NBA caliber. Drazen Petrovic, the Croatian shooting guard, was a scorer of remarkable skill and intensity. Arvydas Sabonis, the Lithuanian center, had been one of the best players in the world for nearly a decade. The world had caught up. The 1988 result wasn't a fluke, it was a measurement. In 1989, FIBA, the international governing body of basketball, voted to allow NBA pros to compete in the Olympics. The amateur requirement, which had kept the world's best players out of the games since 1936, was gone. USA basketball debated. There were people who felt sending pros violated the spirit of the Olympics. There were people who worried about scheduling, about insurance, about egos. There were people who thought it simply wasn't necessary. And then they looked at the 1988 results again. And they thought about the players they could assemble. And they decided to send them. Part 12. The Dream Team. The roster they assembled for the 1992 Barcelona Olympics is the most celebrated collection of basketball players ever gathered on a single team. Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, Michael Jordan, Charles Barkley, Karl Malone, Patrick Ewing, John Stockton, Scottie Pippen, Clyde Drexler, Chris Mullin, David Robinson, and Christian Laettner as the lone college player, a choice that remains debated, particularly given that Shaquille O'Neal and Isaiah Thomas were passed over. Magic's presence carried weight beyond basketball. Just months earlier, in November of '91, he had announced he was HIV positive and retiring from the NBA. His appearance on the Dream Team, healthy, joyful, luminous, was one of the first major public moments of a prominent person living openly with HIV, and it mattered far beyond the sport. Larry Bird, meanwhile, was playing through chronic back pain that would end his career within months. Barcelona was his farewell, even if nobody said so directly. Chuck Daly, the same man who had built the Bad Boy Pistons and devised the Jordan rules, coached the team. His job wasn't to motivate them. It was simply to keep 11 enormous personalities pointed in the same direction. It turned out the Olympics were not a competition. The Dream Team won all 8 games by an average of almost 44 points. Opposing players asked to take photographs with the Americans before tip-off. The practice sessions, by all accounts, were more intense than the actual games. They stood on the podium in Barcelona with gold medals, Magic beaming, Bird smiling through the pain, Jordan wearing an American flag over his shoulder to cover a sponsor's logo. and in doing so they sent a broadcast to the entire world about what basketball was and what it could be. Every young player in Germany, Argentina, France, and Croatia who watched those games carried something away from that summer. Dirk Nowitzki has said it was the moment he decided to take basketball seriously. Tony Parker, Manu Ginobili, and dozens of others have said the same. The seeds of the modern global NBA were planted in that Spanish heat. And there is something worth sitting with at the end of this story. 3,000 years before Jordan soared in Barcelona, an Olmec person carved a stone ring into a wall and invented the idea of putting a round object through an elevated circular goal. That concept traveled across millennia and continents, through Mesoamerican courts, French palm games, English village greens, until a Canadian with a soccer ball and 2 peach baskets put it all together on a December morning in 1891. From those 13 rules grew a game that would fill arenas on 6 continents and culminate, at least for our purposes tonight, in 11 of the greatest players who ever lived standing together on a podium. The whole watching world finally understood what basketball was. I bid you good night.